Kia ora and welcome to this video in our series on writing strategies for research students. Here I'm going to talk about the process of preparing for submission and examination and a little bit about the experience, sort of subjectively, of preparing for submission and examination. So, in another video I've talked in more detail about the overall argument of a research thesis. Just to recap that a bit here. By the time you're ready to submit, you've got a thesis. It may be written in a variety of different styles, but they all make basically the same argument wherever they may put the bits and pieces. And that argument is that you've got a good question, which means the question is original. It addresses something that other people have not fully addressed, and it is significant. And significance doesn't have to mean that your thesis achieves world peace. Significance means that there is some way that your thesis is transformative, that the work that you have done has changed something about the way that we ought to think or the way that we ought to act. And the thesis will also talk about how you followed a good plan to answer that question. Your plan was ethical, and it was obviously feasible because at this point you've been able to do it, and it engaged with best practice in your field. Now, maybe your innovation was a methodological one, and so you may in fact do something quite new in your thesis that other people haven't done before, but nevertheless you've engaged with your method literature as relevant to your thesis. So you followed a good plan. You carried out the plan, and when you carried it out, you learned something. Okay, so it wasn't a foregone conclusion what was going to happen. You engaged in the process of your thesis, and something new for you and for everyone else came out the other side. And then your thesis makes the argument that other people, in particular your examiners, but other people generally, should care about what you learned. This isn't just a private process of self-discovery for you. This is a public activity, and you engage other people who should care, who should change how they think, who should change what they do as a result of the work that you're doing. Now, scholarship is always an ongoing process. We are able to do what we do because other people have come before us, and our work in turn leads to new work. So your thesis is never expected to completely sort of resolve everything that's important in your field. So a thesis acknowledges that there is more to be done. Maybe there are specific questions that emerged in the course of your research, or maybe you've always been aware of a range of things and your research was going to address some of those things and not others. But we situate our research as part of this ongoing process of other research that's going on. We never directly say to an examiner, now I've done all this wonderful stuff, will you please pass my thesis? But that is basically the argumentative point of this, that if you meet all of these standards, if you establish that your thesis work as a whole does all of these things, they should pass you. And so, of course, at a very basic level, before you're ready to submit for examination, you need to make sure you've addressed all this stuff. But often what happens in the process of writing, you write your thesis over a long period of time, you change during that process, the style of the writing often changes, you can become more or less confident in particular points, and sometimes you can lose track of how difficult it is for someone who has not been living in your head for the past several years to find all of the information that explains where you've addressed these things. So, yes, if there's something missing from this list in your thesis, by all means you need to write it, but most of what I'm going to talk about in this video is about how to make sure your examiner notices that you've done all of these things, because it doesn't help to do them and have the examiner miss them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in this video. So every section of your thesis needs to contribute to this overarching argument. Okay, if you're preparing for submission, in your head, you probably know where you address all of these things. You probably have it clear. One of the most difficult things about preparing the final drafts of your thesis for submission is getting yourself out of your own head, externalizing your relationship to the thesis, and thinking about it from the standpoint of someone who isn't you, who isn't your supervisor, who isn't one of your friends who's been following your work for many, many years, but who is seeing it fresh, probably for completely the first time, and they need to make sense of what you're doing. And that's a difficult process that often does not teach you something that you're trying or that you think you're trying to learn. It will actually teach you something quite important, which is how to communicate about your research, and that's really critical to your future career. But it can feel like you've already learned what you need to know, and then there's this horrible slog of just figuring out how to sort of tie it all up and put a bow on it so that your examiner knows where to find everything. But it's extremely important, and it's a dimension of research training that you will come back to again and again and again, because it's something that's actually quite important for our future work. Science, scholarship is a public activity, and communication is a big part of that activity. So you need to start thinking like an examiner or like a reader. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do all the way through the process of doing your thesis, and hopefully you've had a chance to do things, is when you read other people, don't just go for the bottom line. Don't just focus on, well, so what were their findings? What did they conclude? And how does that relate to what I'm concluding? But also focus on your experience as a reader and on other scholars as writers. So hopefully, all the way through the process, but if not before now, please start it now. You're thinking about, if you enjoy reading something, why do you enjoy it? What has the person done that has made that engaging for you as a reader? Those are strategies you may want to think about using to help your examiners follow what's going on. If you're reading something and it's really hard going, it's worth thinking about why that's the case, because you probably don't want to repeat that hard-going stuff and make your reader's job harder than it needs to be. So start thinking like an examiner, start thinking like a reader from as early in the process as you can, and from this point, if not before, start thinking like this. So to your examiner, to any reader, your thesis is entirely new and unfamiliar. Maybe your examiners have seen you at a conference, maybe they've read a publication of yours, but the thesis is a new thing as a work to them. And they cannot rely on years of background and conversation and discussion with you to fill in gaps in your argument. If you skip a step and they are not able to fill that in their own heads, this could be a problem for your thesis, even if you would know how to fill that step in if they were to ask you. Your examiner is a lot more likely to get lost than your supervisors, because your supervisors have also been living with this for a long time. So it's very, very important to start thinking about this from the standpoint of it just landing fresh on someone's desk without them having significant prior knowledge of your particular work process. So one of the things that you're going to want to do in your penultimate or final draft of your thesis is you're going to want to focus on what I think of as roadmaps or signposts or guides for your readers. Very frequently, people will leave these out in earlier drafts, in part because it's not clear, you don't have all the components together, so it's hard to be doing a lot of signposting about what's going on in different bits of the thesis when you haven't written those bits of the thesis yet. In part it happens because you're so focused on trying to figure out what you're doing and then figure out what it means and interpret your data and the rest, that this stuff is kind of secondary to you. You don't need the roadmap. Somebody else needs the roadmap. And so quite frequently, sort of 2 drafts back or 1 draft back from submission, theses are missing these kinds of contents, and they're actually quite important to add in. So the last stage of editing involves strengthening or creating, if they're not there at all, really strong signals to tell your examiner at all times where they are in your overall argument. There's a tendency across the thesis for students to get lost in the thickets of all the detail that they need to cover. You need to be able to pan back from that before you submit, or your examiner is going to get lost in those thickets, and because they're not you, they may get fundamentally lost and not be able to work out where you're trying to go. So let's unpack these a bit. So roadmaps are kind of the high-level structures that help your examiner know what to expect. So they're things like the abstract that you prepare, the table of contents, the introductions to chapters and sections. They tell examiners what to expect from this work. In general, and in most cases, you do not want to surprise an examiner. A surprised examiner is likely to be a confused examiner and might be an annoyed examiner. You want to create expectations, you want to prime your examiner for where you're going, and then you want to satisfy those expectations. It makes it much less likely the examiner is going to start guessing where they think you might be going, and let's say they guess you're going here and you're trying to go there, then you've got the problem that you're going exactly where you mean to go, but because your examiner thought you meant that instead, they're getting increasingly angry because they feel like you're walking off your path when actually they're confused what the path is. A good examiner will go back when they realize they've made that kind of mistake, and they'll reconsider, but examiners are humans and not all humans are good. So you really, really want to kind of examiner-proof your writing. Signposts are more kind of interim signals. So, your roadmap is your big kind of, here's the vista, here's the whole plan. But along the way, particularly in sections that go on at some length and need to cover quite a few steps in an argument, it's a little easy for someone who is not you to lose track of what this is in service of. Why am I reading this stuff? Where is this taking me? And if it goes on for too long without a reminder about why this is in the argument, examiners will start coming up with their own theories about what you're doing, and that may not match what you're actually trying to do. So you want to periodically pan back. I often describe it as coming up for air. You want to take breaks from intricate bits of argument to remind the examiner where you're headed and to tell them kind of where they are along that route. So, examiner, you may remember that I said that we were going to argue this. Well, this is the first step in that argument. And now that we've done that step, we need to do 3 more steps. So let's move on to the second step. So it's these kinds of things. They can feel very repetitive to write. They can feel a little bit boring to you because you know where you're going. But they are very, very important in preventing an examiner from getting lost. I would, in general, rather an examiner criticize a thesis because it's repetitive than criticize a thesis because they have no clue what it was trying to do, and it just went on and on and on, and they couldn't make sense of it. Okay, so these are things that help the amount of sense examiners make become smaller. You're not asking them to keep so much in their head. Remember that an examiner may not read the thesis in the order in which it is laid out. They may skip around in the thesis. Remember also that they are unlikely to read it at one sitting. So you also need to be prepared, and Signpost can help with this, that an examiner may read, your introduction and then jump to your conclusion. Or they may read up through chapter 2, and then they need to set it aside, and they get really busy for a week, and then they pick it up the following week. So you need to be prepared for the fact that this may not all be in head. So it's like a serial TV show that says, last time in my thesis, you may remember that. Okay, so you want to provide those kinds of clues. And transitions are a part of this. So these are moments when you've got an intricate, complicated argument, and you need to shift from one point to the next point. There is a chance that an examiner will miss that kind of internal shift if it is too subtle or if it is not flagged. So you need to ask your examiner to stop thinking about something, to kind of sum up what that something was about, and then to follow you as you move to another area. And examiners need a little bit of warning and a little bit of time to reorient. So transitional moments are everywhere. They can happen between paragraphs, they always happen between sections, and they definitely always happen between chapters. And you want to think about making an explicit transition just to mark the fact that the attention needs to shift, that the subject matter or the line of argument has changed slightly, to make sure your examiner is keeping up. Again, it can feel quite repetitive to write these, because to you this is all really, really familiar and you know how it all fits together, but you need to try to kind of alienate yourself in your text and do these little gestures that help someone else keep up. Again, sometimes an examiner may say, look, I didn't need all the hand-holding. I can follow this just fine. Your supervisor can help you calibrate that. But in my experience, people tend to err in the direction of not doing enough of this rather than in the direction of doing too much. So then there's the issue of consistency. A thesis is a massive work, and it's written over a really long period of time. And during that time you were changing. The process is meant to change you. It's meant to take you from someone who's new in research to someone who is, apprenticed in the process, and then at the end ready to go off on their own and be a fully independent researcher who will design many more research projects and carry them out without this kind of training wheels sort of supervision wrapped around you. It is to be expected that over that length of time, while you're producing writing, you will experience shifts in tone and in style and in your own understanding of your work. And then all of a sudden you're getting close to submission and you've got all these chapters, and they may have been written over a couple of years of your life, and they may not all quite say the same things or express themselves in the same way. You need to work back through those. One stage in the writing process is to make them consistent with each other. So if you're writing a traditional kind of monographic thesis, these are the things that are like books, it should read ideally as if it is written in one voice. And there's some very common kind of simple things to fix, like if you've got an old method chapter that is written as though the method's something you're going to do, because at the point that you wrote it, you hadn't yet done it, you need to fix all of that and put it in the past. It's now something that you have done. But there are often more complex issues, like, for example, you may not have fully appreciated the significance or the impact of the work, or you might have had a surprising finding. And it's quite common that earlier, like literature review and framing chapters and background information, needs to be revisited in light of what you now know about what your research is going to yield. So there's often significant rewriting at the end, not because the earlier writing was necessarily bad, although sometimes that happens too, but because you are different and your understanding of your research is different and more mature. And you want the thesis to reflect that more mature voice, and that's quite difficult. One of the ways to do a consistency check in your thesis, and it's probably helpful to know that examiners sometimes do this themselves, whether you want them to or not, is to think about what sections of your text are meant structurally to mirror each other, and then to try to read those back to back. So your introductory and concluding chapters, many examiners will skip straight to the conclusion. Okay, they'll look at the table of contents, they'll look at the abstract, they'll orient themselves, and then they'll want to see where you're going. And then as they read through, they'll be assessing you on whether you're succeeding in going there. Did you overclaim? Did you fully establish that position? So I would always advise that you read your introductory and concluding chapters back to back. They should say very similar things. Your introduction should not be like a mystery novel. You're not trying to leave the examiner in suspense about where they're headed. The more they know about what you plan to conclude, the better prepared they will be for your argument. And so reading those and often writing those chapters back to back is quite helpful in ensuring consistency. But you also then want to check that, if you're saying in the introduction that you're going to do various things in specific chapters, you want to check that you're doing those things in those chapters, or do you need to say this somewhat differently? The introductions and conclusions of chapters can be similar to this or of sections. So anything that should mirror itself, you want to kind of read those back to back, cut out the stuff in the middle when you read, and it provides you with a way of sort of checking your own consistency. Not everybody writes a monographic style thesis. So if you're doing a portfolio style thesis, for example, by publication, where the middle of it may actually contain disparate works written at different times, and you may or may not be using a model where you edit those works to make them more consistent with each other. When you're doing that kind of thesis, you still need consistency, but it may be provided in kind of bookends or bracketing chapters that you write to introduce and conclude that material and to demonstrate that it has the same coherence and originality and significance and scale and as a traditional monographic thesis. So the fact that everything's already been published is part of the task of a thesis by publication, but you also need to make an overarching case that is about the whole research program and why the whole research program functions at the level of research degree that you are aiming for. So consistency is still an issue. The so what question, which you may have run into at earlier milestones like confirmation, or you may run into at some conferences, we are all expected to be able to talk fluently about why our work matters. And for many students, because you're so in the thickets of your work by the end, it can actually become harder toward the end to back up from that and realize what's significant about your own work. One of the things that I notice often is that sometimes students will overlook really, really important dimensions of their work, because by the time it comes to talking about it at the end, it's so familiar to them. They've been working with it for a year or 2 years at that point, and it's boring to them. They have forgotten that it is new for their field. So this may be an area where you want to work quite closely with your supervisors to make sure that you are actually claiming the significance and the originality that you ought to, based on the work that you're doing. The fact that it is now no longer original to you, the fact that you're really familiar with it, is not the same as it being, not new to the rest of the scholarly community. So you want to communicate what's likely to be new to someone who's hitting your work fresh. There is a complex balance here, because you also do want to acknowledge limitations and that there's always more work to be done, but your work is worthwhile, okay, and you want to walk that balance. Now, again, one common thing that students struggle with at the end, and again, it's because it's so familiar by that point, and you're so used to it, and the frisson, the excitement of discovery may have faded as you've just gotten into the writing it all up stage. And sometimes people, when it comes time to talk about the limitations of their work and the fact that there's more work still to be done, can be much too modest and end up essentially apologizing for the work. Okay, there's a difference between an apology and talking, as we all need to talk, about the limitation and the fact that there is always more work to be done. So your work is worthwhile. You would not be at this point if the work were not worthwhile. This has already been judged in the lead up to this. When you're talking about limitations, you are not meant to apologize for those limitations or be defensive about those limitations. You're just acknowledging a reality of work, and it should be a source of excitement. There's more still to be done. Maybe you will do some of it in postdoctoral work. Examiners like the idea that your thesis is not a terminus. The work's not going to stop here. There's something more there. So it's not a bad thing that there's more to be done. And when talking about limitations and when talking about future work that remains to be done, keep that in mind. You're not meant to be sorry about what you didn't do. You're meant to be happy about what you did do, but there's more to come. Arrogance is something that I see more at the research proposal stage, and it's usually accidental at that stage rather than people really being arrogant emotionally. But if at the end of the thesis you are still in this position of sort of making really extravagant claims and claiming that sort of no one out there has ever foreseen anything, even vaguely like what you're doing, you need to be aware that with great claims come great examiner skepticism. Okay, so the bolder you are, and you can be bold, but if you are bold, you better be able to back it up. Okay, so be cautious. You don't have to paint a huge target on your back, usually, in order to showcase what's original and significant about your work. The practice of being generous to other scholars is beneficial. Some of those other scholars might be your examiners. Some of them might be reviewers for future work that you do. Unless you have to pick a gigantic fight, there's usually not a good reason to do so. The other thing to remember is that a thesis is judged, it is examined based on its precision and on its thoroughness. It is not judged and examined based on its kind of girth. Okay, it does not have to have massive impact, but it has to be extremely precise and rigorous in defining the kind of impact that it has. So just be cautious if you're finding yourself making really bold claims, although, as I said, in my experience, students by the end are more likely to be too apologetic than they are to be too bold. Your mileage may vary. Final editing will take a lot longer than you think it will. And it is a stage where if you have capacity to really take time away from everything else and focus on it, I would recommend it. Not everybody can. Many of us, I had to work when I was doing my thesis, many people do. But if you are able, this is a good time, this sort of getting from the penultimate draft to the final draft, really kind of being able to focus on nothing but the thesis is helpful. Examiners may not know you at all. And so one of the challenges with writing a thesis and sending it off in the world to be examined is that examiners need to initially use a proxy for how much they're willing to trust you, because the nature of research is such that you're creating new knowledge. you're generating new material, and therefore you're intrinsically taking the examiner past what they currently know. So an examiner can't examine a thesis the way they might be able to mark a test that they assign in a regular classroom where they know all the content and so they know that the answer is right or not. A thesis is different. You're taking everyone into a new space, into an unknown realm, and therefore people can't assess it totally based on what they already know. So they use proxies, and there are many, many proxies. They'll use your literature review as a proxy to see if you're citing all the works that they expect you to cite. They will use the method chapter as a proxy to see if your method seems sensible. They use lots of proxies. But one proxy that it's important not to overlook is all of the little detail stuff. Is the thesis formatted consistently? They probably won't care exactly how it's formatted, but it'll strike them as weird if Chapter 2 is formatted differently from Chapter 3. Grammar, spelling, punctuation, the rigor of your referencing and the consistency of your referencing in your works cited or bibliography. Some examiners will take that as a proxy measure for how thorough and precise and careful you are as a scholar. It is a proxy that can be unfair, particularly when you're talking about kind of grammar and usage in a period when many of us are writing theses in a language that is not the language we grew up with, but it is there, and you need to be aware of it. So don't neglect, leave yourself enough time to deal with these small-scale, formatting and grammar and sort of proofreading kinds of issues, because some examiners will use them. If they catch several typos in the opening chapter, they may sort of heighten their skepticism of everything that you're doing, and you really don't want that. You may want to take advantage of editing help, okay? By the end of your thesis, probably both you and your supervisors have seen so many different versions of at least some of the chapters that you may be too close to the text, and your brain may just not see a typo anymore, because it's not really reading the words, it's filling in a lot of the content. So you can consider strategies like pairing up with another student, ideally somebody whose work you haven't been reading a lot the whole time through, so pair up with somebody where both of you are relatively new to each other's work, and edit each other's work, because your eyes will see things and their eyes will see things that at this point you can't see about your own work. Professional copy editors can be useful. You want to make sure that you're working with someone who understands academic writing specifically, because there are very specific expectations and, things that you'd want to pay attention to that you might not need to if you're editing other kind of work. And you need to also make sure that you're working with someone who understands the ethics of editing a thesis. They need to proofread your work. They cannot intervene in the content of your work because it violates sort of academic integrity expectations. And you don't want to get to the final stage in a thesis and then have an over-interventionist editor suddenly call into question whether you can receive your degree. Often universities will have lists of editors that they trust, and so using that can be useful, but it can also be quite expensive. So strategies like pairing up with other students are a lower cost and often good enough measure. Now, up until a couple of years ago, when I delivered talks like this, I was always saying that it was really boring and stressful when you got to this final stage where all you're doing is editing typos. And then I delivered a session like this with a colleague who had a different experience, and they found it really relaxing when they got to this point, because they felt like they'd done all the hard stuff, and they found it calming to just kind of edit grammar and typos and fix their references and things like this. So some people find this final stage calming, but on balance, I think many people find this final stage of editing really, really difficult. The exciting bits of the thesis, the stuff that you wanted to learn, many people feel like they've learned, and then it's just a terrible focus on details for this last several months while you're getting ready to submit. And it's also quite anxiety-inducing, because then, you're at the point where once it goes off, you have no more control over it. It is what it is. The examiners will think what they think. Now, you should try not to be too stressed, as in your supervisors will probably not let you send your thesis for examination until they believe that you are ready. And examiners really don't want to fail a thesis. It's not that it never happens, but examiners generally want to read a thesis because they are genuinely excited about the next generation, and they want to help, and they want to give back. But nevertheless, this is an anxiety-filled period for a lot of people. And because of that, there is also a tendency to really hole up in this period and not do anything else and spend all day trying to correct the thesis and get to the point that, your eyes are sort of swimming and you can't see anything. Try not to do that. You will actually be a better editor of your work if you regularly take breaks. You will be more connected as well. Once the thesis goes in, it's an extraordinary period because you've spent years of your life focused on this one goal, and then suddenly there it is, and it's done. And then what? So it's really important to have a life away from the thesis, to take breaks, to engage with friends, to engage with family, to have things that are you beyond the thesis. There's often a period of reorientation once the big project is done, trying to figure out what to do with yourself now. And you want support structures that are not wholly consumed within your thesis project to support you during that